One review. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years. And today I have my special guest. He's the author of the book Blood Flow, no other than Mr. Larry Bograd.
Thank you, Daniel. Good to be with you.
Welcome to Book 101, Mr. Larry. And can you please introduce more about yourself?
Sure. I live in Denver, Colorado. I actually started writing children's books in the 1980s. My first book won Best Book of the Year award for children. I, Altogether, I did 13 children's books, three picture books, three middle grade readers, and five young adult novels. I did run into some censorship issues. Largely because I tried to tell the truth about adolescent life, sexuality, drug use, things of that nature. So after that, I formed a theater company with my wife, Colleen Hubbard. We ran that for a while, and we also ended up making a couple of documentary films together. And the book we're discussing, Blood Flow, is the result of over 40 years of trying to get the story right. I wrote a version of it when I was 19. I probably revised it every decade since. In the middle of these decades, I had an unexpected open heart surgery, so I folded that narrative into the memoir as well. And I finished this version about a year ago, and I'm not going to rewrite it, so this is it.
This is it, people. Mr. Larry Bograd, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge to the world. So, can you tell us about your father who was beyond tragedy?
Yeah, my father was born in Eastern Europe in a very small Jewish town that is now part of the Ukraine. He immigrated to the United States when he was 3 years old, when there was a lot of anti-Semitism and there was pogroms. Uh, his family who stayed there were all murdered by the Nazis. He settled in Newark, New Jersey um, during the Depression, had a bunch of odd jobs. And then he had an older brother, 16 years older, Michael Bograd, who came to Denver because of TB back in the 1920s and 30s. Denver was a center for TB cures. And then eventually he brought my dad out in the 1940s. My dad went to undergraduate school in the University of Denver, and then he went to medical school. And then he was drafted into the occupation forces as a doctor and served in Trieste, Italy after World War II. And soon after he got home, he had his first of three psychiatric hospital admissions. And now, when I was a kid, 13 years old, I only knew of his last one because that's the one that actually resulted in his death at home. But he was a very successful general practitioner, family doctor here in Denver, very beloved. We as kids, I have two siblings, we really had no idea of my dad's mental health issues. But he was hospitalized 2 days after my bar mitzvah. And then about 12 days later, he was sent home on an ill-advised day pass, even against the advice of some of the psychiatric nurses who were overruled by doctors. And while he was home, he committed suicide. So that's kind of his story in a nutshell.
So, Mr. Larry, what was the most difficult part of revisiting your family story after so many years?
I'd say among the most difficult parts were getting the hospitalization records out. Hospitals are very reticent to release records, even though my father had died many years before. But eventually I was able to get hospital records sent to me, and they gave me a kind of snapshot of how the hospital felt about my dad diagnostically and biographically at the time. So, I learned a lot about his childhood, and then I also uh, learned that I knew it, but I also still saw in the hospital records that he most likely had a brain tumor that was inoperable that may have contributed to his suicide. It's not clear though because there was no autopsy. Um, so I think that was one of the key points in my book was unearthing those hospitalization records.
So, Mr. Larry, how did writing Blood Flow change your understanding of grief and healing?
Well, it's interesting. I'm almost 72 years old, and I did learn that no matter how much you learn about a parent who dies, the grief is never gone 100%. There's a lot of triggers. I'll drive by a street where my dad had his office, and I'll, kind of have a lot of memories of being with him there, uh, things like that. Um, I also learned over the years that I think if you're compassionate towards the person that dies, even if it seems that maybe they committed that suicide was maybe something that hurt you or maybe even was targeted at you. But if part of your grief is compassion, then I think that also makes grief much more palatable.
Totally agree, Mr. Larry. So, how did your relationship with your own identity shift as you wrote this book?
Well, I think it actually shifted much earlier. I mean, I may be kind of making this up, but I actually don't think I would have ended up in the arts as a writer if my dad had lived. My guess is that I might have gone into some kind of professional um, work like attorney, doctor, things of that nature. So, in one way, it freed me to expand on my creative skills and take advantage of my talents. So I'd say, that's probably one of the most significant things that happened as a result of my dad's suicide.
You mentioned a 40 years journey. Were there key moments along the way that pushed you toward a deeper understanding?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, he was getting hospital records. Some were dating from 1949, others were dating from 1962, when my siblings and I were told that our dad was going to the East Coast to have some more training, that in fact he was going to be admitted to a hospital. Also, very early in my 20s, I started interviewing relatives of my father. I met some first cousins of his who I only met for the first time when I interviewed them, and they gave me a good sense of what it was like to to see him come home from Trieste after the war and how his psychology had radically changed for the worse. Other landmarks included going to Europe. I went to Trieste. I didn't necessarily learn a lot there, but I was there to kind of feel what it was like and talk to some locals. And then I went further east into Eastern Europe. I went to the town where my dad was born, where again, I didn't necessarily learn anything, but I just kind of wanted to go as far with that journey as I can from a geographical point of view. So those would be, among the landmarks.
So, Mr. Larry, was there a moment of breakthrough or clarity that you share in the book?
I don't think there was one moment of breakthrough. I think it was kind of like building breakthrough, if that makes sense to you.
Makes
Um,
sense.
I think every time I talked to a relative, I also interviewed my mother a bunch of times, um, and also just talked to doctors and people like that. It just was another piece in the puzzle. So I think in a way that was kind of an interesting thing for me, and I think the book reflects all these different ways that I kind of put the story together.
How did the stigma around mental health and suicide impact your ability to grieve or understand your father's death?
Well, that's a great question. I was in seventh grade or middle school here in the States. And when I went back to school 2 weeks after my father died, nobody, nobody would talk to me. And I wasn't, I kind of had a feeling that the word was out. It had been an article in the newspaper that he had killed himself. So I think there's always a stigma. It's also sometimes when I mention to people how my dad died, I think they maybe went a little extra in their empathy. Um, so I think, and sadly, I think there still is a big stigma about suicide. Um, I certainly think it's preventable in a lot of cases. I don't think it was preventable in my dad's situation because he was kind of going through a psychotic depressive episode. But it definitely makes people kind of take a pause when I tell them how my dad died.
So, what role does forgiveness, both of yourself and your father, play in blood flow?
I didn't really feel I had to forgive him. It's in the book, but one time my mother saw a therapist and she came home and she said, it's okay to be really angry with dad. He really did something to upset the family and cause us a lot of financial and emotional trauma. But I never actually felt that kind of anger for him. I really did try to understand what he was going through. So to, I do understand your questions about forgiveness, but I don't think it really applied to my dad. And since I never felt I was at fault, I didn't feel that I had to also forgive myself in any way. And even when I
Be-
maybe considered things that maybe,
Sorry, beautifully articulated. Mr. Larry, go ahead.
you know, there were some relatives who felt that my mother maybe pushed my dad to work too hard. She was materialistic. And there were some years where I felt some negative feelings towards her because of that. But I mean, ultimately, and part of writing the book, I think she did the best she could, like most people. And I think she was in a tough position. And she also told me how she really tried to prop my dad up and support him when he was in depressive episodes. So I didn't necessarily have to forgive her, but I did say to her that I really underestimated what she went through just in terms of when my dad was alive and the effect of her.
Mr. Larry, are there particular memories of your father that brought you comfort while writing the book?
Yeah, I mean, he was a very funny guy. I mean, he took us to Atlantic City, New Jersey when I was 10 years old, and without any hesitation, he dove into the water. And then when he came up, he did kind of like a muscle man pose, even though he was not in shape at that point in his life. So I think a lot of his humor, um, and I think also just knowing that he was such a good doctor, there's a lot of things that I learned too. So um, he used to play sports with my brother and me. He used to come home from work wearing a suit and tie, and he would loosen his tie and play basketball with us in our driveway. So those are the kind of memories, just kind of dad memories I have of him that I really are fond of.
Mr. Larry, how do you hope blood flow will help others who have experienced loss from suicide?
Well, as I indicated, I mean, I think my story is singular, but on the other hand, there's lot of people lose people they love, and sadly, there's a lot of children who lose a parent. But I guess I would maybe encourage people if they're in the right mindset to try to go back and try to fill out their picture of a parent. If maybe the child was older, they might have heard these stories directly. But I personally feel that I really like not the genealogy so much as the expansion of my understanding of my father. So if you're writing this book, I do think you have to make sure that you're not settling any scores, blaming anybody,
Yes.
and that you also need to know that there's a lot of ways to get information that may help you understand what was behind the suicide.
What advice would you offer to someone still struggling decades after losing a loved one?
Well, it's really hard. I mean, I think your question earlier about forgiveness is a good place to start. Um, you know, there may be instances where you do have to forgive a parent, even kind of metaphorically. Maybe they just got sick and died, and or they died from other kinds of misbehavior, things like that. Um, but I do think it's really important for people, even adult, to learn what they can about their parents, because ultimately, I think a lot of our personalities, even though we all like to feel that we're kind of self-made, and a lot of it is just genetics and being growing up in a certain environment.
Totally agree, Mr. Larry. Forgiveness and let it go. So, what will be your short term and long term goals in writing?
Well, I've been at this a long time. I published my first book when I was 24 years old. I'm almost 72. I still would like to get a literary novel published. I would maybe like to get blood blood flow or some other things I've written into film or television, because I think they would be good dramatic stories. So those would be kind of my short term and long term goals. When I say short term, I'm also reflecting the fact that I'm 72. I don't know how much short term I have left. So,
Definitely. So, did writing this book bring a sense of closure, or was it more about opening a dialogue?
it really did bring closure. It also made me feel really grateful for my life that I did have. I feel really grateful that I had and up until the suicide, I really had a good childhood, even though I was kind of a lonely kid and a nerd and that kind of stuff. I wasn't an athlete, but I felt love for my parents, and I think, when I met my wife, we fell in love, and then we had three daughters, and we have a very loving family, which really helped me in my closure and also gave me kind of a wider definition of love. So I think those are the couple of the things that I think about. So I don't think you ever 100% have closure, because as you get older, you might reflect on things. For me, for instance, uh, as I got older, I reflected about that my dad never lived to be a grandfather. He never lived to meet my wife. He, in fact, never even lived to see me graduate from high school. Um, so I think sometimes as you move through life, there's closure in terms of understanding, but I don't think there's closure in terms of the relationship, if that makes sense to you.
Makes sense, Mr. Larry. So, how do you personally define healing after writing Blood Flow?
I think healing, I think healing has to include compassion towards others. Um, Now there's some horrible things that happen to people, and maybe they're not forgivable, or maybe they're not, and they're certainly probably not forgettable. But I think that's one thing that I would have people consider. And again, I just think as much understanding of the events and about the person that you lost, and really what they contributed to your life in any possible positive ways, can help with that grief.
Definitely inspiring, Mr. Larry. Totally inspiring. So, before we wrap up our discussion for today, I'm inviting you to please do listen my audiobooks, people audiobooks, available on Audible. Of course, Book 101 Review, Volume 3 Suggestions, Book 101 Volume 2 selected, and Book 101 review highly recommended. These are the product of my first season of Book 101 review, and of course, my self help book, Threads of Existence, Weaving the Tapestry of Life, and Stand Tall, Stand Together, Breaking the Chains of Bullying, and Life is Too Short, a journey of discovery, fulfillment, and joy. And of course, my climate change book, Earth Fever, Unraveling Climate and Our Race to Restore Balance. Please do listen to them because one of the best sellers on Audible. So, Mr. Larry, looking back on your 40-year journey, what would you tell your younger self about grief, loss, and hope?
Well, parent loss is not a dead end. Life goes on. There's plenty of other reasons to love life, and I think that's kind of what I'm hearing about your audiobooks as well. So don't be defined by, try not to be defined by trauma, but rather try to be defined by how you came to understand it and hopefully overcame it. Uh, and realize that there's a lot of good things in life. I really consider myself a very, very fortunate person, even with this childhood trauma.
Certainly, people, life is too short. Let it go and forgive. Mr. Larry Bograd, thank you so much for sharing your books to the world, especially your blood flow. So, can you please invite our listeners to support your books?
Sure. I have a website that's really my name.com, Larry Bograd, Bograd, Larry Bograd, all one word.com. You'll find out about blood flow as well as my other creative works. Get a chance to see some photos, and some family albums and things like that. So that would probably be the easiest way to get in contact with me and learn more about blood flow and my life.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Larry Bograd because if you support him, more and more and more empowering books like this to come. So, Mr. Larry, thank you so much for your time.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Daniel.
More to come, people. See you soon.